What if I told you that one of the most powerful companies in human history did not begin with a master plan, a wealthy founder, or a breakthrough backed by governments or corporations? What if I told you it began with two young men, almost no money, no formal business experience, and a belief that most people around them thought was unrealistic? What if I told you that at the time, nearly everyone who saw the idea dismissed it as unnecessary, impractical, or meaningless? This is the story of how Apple began. Not as a giant, not as a leader, but as something most people barely noticed. The world before Apple. In the early 1970s, computers were not part of everyday life. They were large, expensive machines used by governments, universities, and large corporations. A single computer could fill an entire room. Operating one required trained professionals. Ordinary people did not interact with them, and there was no expectation that they ever would. Computers were tools for specialists. They were not seen as personal devices. The idea that someone might own a computer at home was viewed as unnecessary and impractical. Businesses did not build computers for individuals, they built them for institutions. Software was designed for professionals. Interfaces were complex and unfriendly. Design focused only on function, not ease of use. This was the environment in which Apple was born. A world that did not believe it needed personal computers. Steve Wozniak, building for the sake of building. Steve Wozniak was an engineer, but more than that, he was a builder. From a young age, he loved electronics. He enjoyed taking things apart, understanding how they worked and improving them. He was fascinated by efficiency, how to do more with less. Wozniak did not chase status. He did not seek attention. His satisfaction came from solving technical problems in elegant ways. By the mid-1970s, he was working at Hewlett-Packard, a respected technology company. He had a steady job and no plans to start a business. In his free time, Wozniak built computers for himself. He saw them as personal projects, not commercial products. He enjoyed the challenge of designing a machine that was smaller, simpler, and cheaper than what existed at the time. He did not think the world was waiting for his invention. Steve Jobs, seeing what others did not. Steve Jobs was different. He was focused not on engineering details, he was focused on ideas, meaning, and experience. He cared deeply about design, not just how something looked, but how it felt to use. Jobs believed technology should be approachable. He disliked complexity and believed products should feel intuitive even to people with no technical background. He was also persuasive. When Jobs believed in something, he pushed others to see it the same way. He could be intense, demanding, and difficult, but he was also convincing. When Jobs saw Wozniak's computer designs, he did not see a hobby. He saw possibility. The Homebrew Computer Club. One of the most important influences on Apple's early story was a group called the Homebrew Computer Club. It was not a company or institution, it was a gathering of hobbyists who met to share ideas about computers. People brought homemade machines, exchanged schematics, and discussed new components. There was no competition, knowledge was shared freely. Wozniak attended these meetings regularly. At one meeting, he demonstrated a computer he had designed. Unlike most hobby computers of the time, it used a keyboard and could connect to a display. This mattered. Most computers used switches and lights. They were difficult to use. Wozniak's design felt more human, more accessible. To most people at the meeting, it was an impressive technical achievement. To Jobs, it was something else. From a hobby to a product. Wozniak wanted to share his design freely. He enjoyed the respect of fellow hobbyists and believed knowledge should be open. Jobs disagreed. He believed the computer could be sold. He argued that if people paid for it, it would be taken seriously. Selling it could also allow them to build better versions. This disagreement marked the beginning of a pattern that would define Apple for decades. Wozniak focused on making things work. Jobs focused on making things matter. Eventually, Jobs convinced Wozniak to try selling the computer. They needed money to build the first units. They had none. So they sold personal belongings. Jobs sold his van. Wozniak sold his calculator. The amounts were small, but it was enough to begin. The garage. They worked out of a garage belonging to Jobs' family in California. It was not a laboratory, it was not a factory. It was an ordinary garage with limited space and basic tools. They assembled circuit boards by hand. They tested components repeatedly. Mistakes were common. Progress was slow. There was no sense of scale. They were not thinking about growth, dominance, or global influence. They were simply trying to make something work. The Apple I. Their first product became known as the Apple I. It was not a complete computer by modern standards. Buyers still needed to add a keyboard, display, and power supply. But it worked, and it was different. It represented a shift in thinking. It suggested that computers did not have to be distant institutional machines. They could exist in personal spaces. A local computer store agreed to buy several units. This was the first real validation. The sale did not make them rich, but it proved demand existed. For the first time, Apple moved from idea to reality. A company is formed. In 1976, Jobs, Wozniak, and a third partner, Ronald Wayne, officially formed Apple Computer. Wayne soon left, selling his shares early. At the time, the decision seemed reasonable. No one could see what Apple would become. Jobs searched for investors. Many said no. Personal computers were still seen as risky. Eventually, a former Intel executive named Mike Markula invested and helped shape Apple into a real company. Structure began to form. Employees were hired. The garage phase began to end. But Apple was still fragile. The first sign of something bigger. With the Apple II, the company took a different approach. This was not just a machine for hobbyists. It was designed for ordinary people. It had a plastic case. It supported color graphics. It came ready to use. Sales grew steadily. Schools adopted it. Small businesses used it. Software developers followed. For the first time, Apple looked like it might survive. No one imagined what it would become. After the success of the Apple II, Apple stopped being an experiment and became a company under pressure. Orders increased. Revenue grew. New employees were hired quickly. What had once been a small group working informally now needed structure, management, and discipline. Apple did not grow slowly. It grew faster than its internal systems could handle. Most employees were young. Many were inexperienced. Very few had worked inside a large organization before. Decisions were often made based on urgency rather than long-term planning. The company survived this phase not because it was well organized, but because the product continued to sell. Steve Jobs and the need for control. As Apple expanded, Steve Jobs began asserting more control over the company's direction. Jobs believed deeply that Apple should not be like other technology companies. He rejected the idea of compatibility with competitors. He disliked compromise. He believed the company should control every detail of its products. This belief shaped Apple's culture. Jobs demanded intense focus from employees. He expected long hours and complete dedication. He criticized work openly if it did not meet his standards. Some employees were motivated by this environment. Others found it stressful and unpredictable. Jobs did not see himself as harsh. He believed pressure was necessary to create great products. Wozniak steps back. While Apple expanded, Steve Wozniak moved in the opposite direction. Wozniak remained focused on engineering. He enjoyed building computers, but had little interest in corporate management. He disliked internal politics and conflict. As Apple grew, Wozniak's influence over company decisions slowly decreased. He remained respected, but Jobs increasingly shaped Apple's identity. This shift marked a turning point. Apple became more vision-driven and less engineer-led. Apple becomes a public company. In 1980, Apple went public. The initial public offering created instant wealth for early employees. Jobs became a millionaire in his 20s. Apple became one of the most talked about companies in the country. But going public changed Apple permanently. The company now had shareholders. It had to meet financial expectations. Growth was no longer optional, it was required. This pressure conflicted with Jobs' desire for perfection and control. Delays became costly, mistakes became public. Apple was no longer free to experiment quietly. IBM enters the market. As Apple grew, larger companies took notice. IBM, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, entered the personal computer market. Unlike Apple, IBM chose an open system approach. Other companies could build compatible machines, software could be shared. This strategy caused IBM-compatible computers to spread rapidly. Prices fell, competition increased. Apple's closed system made its products unique, but also expensive. Internally, debates intensified. Some executives argued Apple should license its software or adopt open standards. Jobs strongly opposed this. He believed Apple must remain different, even if it meant losing market share. This decision would have long-term consequences. The Macintosh project begins. Jobs wanted to build a computer that anyone could use. He became focused on graphical user interfaces, windows, icons, and a mouse. He believed this approach would make computers intuitive rather than technical. The Macintosh project began as a small internal effort. Soon, Jobs took control. He pushed the team relentlessly. Deadlines were tight. Expectations were high. Jobs demanded perfection in both design and function. The Macintosh team operated almost like a separate company within Apple. Jobs encouraged them to see themselves as rebels working against mediocrity. This culture created loyalty, but also burnout. Internal tension grew. As Macintosh development continued, tension inside Apple increased. Costs rose, timelines slipped, other divisions felt ignored, executives worried about risk. Jobs resisted compromise. He believed the product must be revolutionary or not exist at all. The board began to question his leadership style. Apple was growing, but stability was weakening. The moment before the fall. By the early 1980s, Apple stood at a crossroads. It had money, talent, and visibility, but it also had internal conflict, rising competition, and leadership tension. The company was about to release one of the most important products in its history. What followed would change Apple and Steve Jobs forever. The launch of the Macintosh was supposed to be Apple's defining moment. For years, Steve Jobs had pushed the Macintosh team relentlessly. He believed the product would change how people interacted with computers. He wanted it to be simple, friendly, and visually different from anything else on the market. By the time the Macintosh was ready, Apple had invested enormous resources into its development. Expectations were high, both inside and outside the company. In January 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh to the world with one of the most famous advertisements in history. The commercial presented Apple as a challenger to conformity and control. It positioned the Macintosh not just as a computer, but as a symbol of individuality. The message was clear. Apple was different. The reality after the launch. Despite the excitement, the Macintosh did not immediately meet expectations. The computer was innovative, but it was also limited. It lacked sufficient memory. Software options were few. It was expensive compared to IBM-compatible machines that offered more flexibility. Sales were slower than anticipated. Internally, frustration grew. Apple had bet heavily on the Macintosh, but the market response was mixed. Executives began questioning Jobs' decisions. Jobs responded by pushing harder. He blamed marketing, sales teams, and even customers for not understanding the product. He resisted suggestions to lower prices or compromise on design. This response increased tension between Jobs and Apple's leadership. John Sculley and the struggle for control. To manage Apple's growing complexity, the board had hired John Sculley, a former Pepsi executive. Sculley had strong experience in marketing and corporate management, but limited understanding of technology. Jobs initially supported Sculley's hiring. He believed Sculley could help Apple grow, while Jobs focused on vision and product. However, their relationship deteriorated quickly. Sculley focused on stability, predictability, and profitability. Jobs focused on innovation, control, and long-term vision. Their priorities clashed repeatedly. Meetings became tense, decisions stalled. Employees felt caught between two leaders with different philosophies. As Macintosh sales continued to disappoint, the board began siding more often with Sculley. The removal of Steve Jobs. By 1985, the situation reached a breaking point. Jobs attempted to organize internal resistance against Sculley. When this effort failed, the board intervened. Steve Jobs was stripped of operational control. He was removed from his leadership role within Apple. At the age of 30, the co-founder of Apple was effectively pushed out of the company he helped create. The decision shocked employees and observers. Jobs was seen as the heart of Apple's identity, even if he was difficult to work with. Soon after, Jobs resigned and left the company entirely. Apple without Jobs. After Jobs' departure, Apple continued operating, but its direction became unclear. The company still had strong products, loyal customers, and significant resources. However, it struggled to define its identity without Jobs' vision. Apple released numerous computer models, often with confusing differences. Product lines overlapped. Marketing messages lacked clarity. The company focused on incremental improvements rather than bold innovation. While Apple remained profitable for a time, it slowly lost market share to cheaper, more flexible IBM-compatible systems. The industry moved forward. During this period, Microsoft's Windows operating system became increasingly dominant. PC manufacturers adopted standard components and competed aggressively on price. The software ecosystem expanded rapidly around Windows. Developers prioritized compatibility with the largest user base. Apple's closed system, once a strength, became a limitation. Its products were more expensive and less compatible with industry standards. Internal debates about licensing and openness resurfaced, but leadership hesitated to change direction. Apple remained committed to being different, but struggled to explain why that difference still mattered. Steve Jobs in exile. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs founded a new company called Next. Next focused on building high-end computers for education and research. Jobs applied the same design obsession and control that defined his time at Apple. Next computers were advanced but expensive. Sales were limited. Commercial success did not come easily. However, Next developed a powerful operating system that would later become extremely important. At the same time, Jobs acquired a small animation studio that would eventually become Pixar. This venture would later achieve enormous success, but at the time it was uncertain. Jobs' years away from Apple were marked by struggle, learning, and gradual change. Apple's slow decline. Back at Apple, Problems continued to accumulate. Leadership changed several times. Strategic direction shifted frequently. Long-term planning suffered. The company attempted to expand into new product categories, including handheld devices and consumer electronics, but many projects failed or were canceled. Costs increased. Market share declined. Apple's reputation weakened. By the mid-1990s, Apple was no longer seen as an industry leader. It was viewed as a struggling company surviving on brand loyalty rather than innovation. Analysts questioned whether Apple could survive. The operating system crisis. One of Apple's most serious problems was its aging operating system. Apple needed a modern system to compete with Windows. Internal development efforts failed repeatedly. Time ran out. Eventually, Apple made a surprising decision. They acquired Next. This acquisition brought Steve Jobs back to Apple, not as a leader at first, but as an advisor. Few realized how significant this moment would become. The return begins quietly. Jobs did not immediately take control. He observed. He listened. He evaluated Apple's problems. Over time, his influence grew. Leadership changes followed. Decisions became sharper. By 1997, Apple was close to collapse. That same year, Steve Jobs became interim CEO. The company that had once removed him now depended on him for survival. A company at the edge. When Jobs returned to leadership, Apple was losing money. Product lines were bloated. Morale was low. Jobs moved quickly. He cut projects, simplified product lines, ended partnerships that did not align with Apple's future. Many employees were laid off. Critics called his actions harsh. Jobs saw them as necessary. Apple had reached a moment where survival mattered more than comfort. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was at a crossroads. It was financially fragile, creatively stagnant, and struggling to define its identity. The market was dominated by PCs running Microsoft Windows, and competitors were producing lower-cost machines with broader compatibility. Apple, once known for its bold innovation, had become a niche brand. Jobs immediately recognized that Apple could not continue as it had been. Incremental improvements, marketing gimmicks, and small-scale experimentation were not enough. The company required focus, discipline, and clarity of purpose. Jobs began restructuring Apple almost immediately. He simplified the product lines drastically. The sprawling collection of computers was reduced to just 4 main categories: desktops and laptops for consumers and professionals. Unnecessary projects were terminated, freeing resources for key initiatives. Jobs also ended partnerships that did not align with Apple's long-term vision. At the same time, Jobs prioritized design and user experience above all else. Apple would not compete on price. It would compete on quality, simplicity, and integration. Every decision, from the shape of a computer case to the interface on the screen, was scrutinized. Every product had to feel coherent, polished, and intuitive. The birth of the iMac. One of the first major successes after Jobs' return was the iMac, released in 1998. The iMac was unlike any other computer at the time. It had a colorful, translucent case that stood out visually from the gray, beige boxes that dominated the market. But the iMac's significance went far beyond aesthetics. It introduced features designed to simplify the user experience: USB ports for easy peripheral connection, plug-and-play installation, and built-in networking capabilities. The iMac demonstrated that Apple could still innovate in ways competitors could not. The iMac also served as a statement of purpose. It was Apple declaring that it would focus on what mattered most: design, usability, and user experience. It appealed to consumers who had previously been intimidated by computers. Suddenly, Apple was relevant again. iPod, iTunes, and the revolution in music. After the success of the iMac, Apple moved into new markets. One of the most transformative was the music industry. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod, a portable music player with a simple interface and a compact design. The iPod was paired with iTunes, a digital music management system that allowed users to purchase, organize, and play songs on their devices. This combination changed how people bought and consumed music. Apple created an ecosystem, integrating hardware, software, and services in a way that competitors had not. The iPod was not just a product, it was a cultural phenomenon. It demonstrated Apple's ability to identify emerging consumer needs, design a solution, and deliver a complete experience. It also set the stage for Apple's later dominance in mobile technology. The iPhone and the mobile revolution. Building on lessons from the iMac and iPod, Apple entered the mobile phone market in 2007 with the launch of the iPhone. The iPhone combined a phone, a music player, and an internet device in a single touchscreen interface. Jobs insisted that every aspect be tightly integrated. The hardware, the operating system, and the applications were all controlled by Apple. At first, many industry observers doubted the iPhone's potential. Phones with physical keyboards were still common, and established manufacturers dominated the market. But the iPhone's design and functionality quickly proved revolutionary. The App Store, launched in 2008, further solidified Apple's ecosystem. By allowing third-party developers to create applications that ran seamlessly on iPhones, Apple created a platform that extended far beyond the hardware itself. The iPhone became both a product and a gateway to an entire ecosystem of software and services. iPad and the new category of computing. Following the iPhone, Apple introduced the iPad in 2010. The iPad was positioned as a device between a smartphone and a laptop. Critics were skeptical. Many believed it unnecessary. However, the iPad created and elevated by relentless focus on excellence. From the garage to the world stage, Apple's story is a blueprint for modern business, but also a reminder that success requires risk,